The morning mist hung heavy over the palace grounds as Marcus Chen adjusted his crisp uniform for the third time. His hands trembled slightly, not from the cold October air but from the weight of responsibility that came with his first week as a royal sentinel. The golden badge on his chest caught the early sunlight streaming through the ancient oak trees that lined the ceremonial pathway. At 24, Marcus had dreamed of this moment since childhood. Growing up in a small mining town, he had watched the royal ceremonies on television with his grandmother, mesmerized by the precision and dignity of the guards who protected the monarchy. His grandmother would point to the screen with her weathered finger and say, "Those men carry the honor of our nation, Marcus. They stand between order and chaos." Now he was one of them, positioned at Gate 7 of the palace complex, the eastern entrance reserved for diplomatic vehicles and special guests. The assignment was considered routine for a new recruit, but Marcus took it seriously. His training instructor, Sergeant Williams, had drummed into every cadet that there was no such thing as a routine day in royal protection. The radio on his shoulder crackled, softly with periodic check-ins from other sentinels positioned throughout the sprawling estate. Sector 4, all clear. Main gate, no issues to report. The familiar rhythm of these communications had become oddly comforting to Marcus over his short tenure. As he walked the perimeter of his assigned area, Marcus noticed the usual morning activity beginning to stir. Kitchen staff wheeled carts of fresh produce toward the service entrances. Groundskeepers emerged from maintenance buildings with their equipment, preparing to tend to the immaculate gardens that surrounded the palace. A small group of tourists had already gathered beyond the outer fence, cameras ready to capture any glimpse of royal activity. The October air carried the scent of fallen leaves and the distant aroma of fresh bread from the palace kitchens. Marcus found himself thinking about his girlfriend Sarah, who worked as a nurse in the city hospital. She had been worried about his new position, expressing concerns about the dangers that came with protecting such high-profile targets. "The world is different now," she had said the night before his first shift. "There are people out there who want to make statements, and they don't care who gets hurt." Her words echoed in his mind as he continued his patrol. The intelligence briefings during training had been sobering. Threats against the monarchy had increased in recent years, ranging from disorganized protesters to more serious security concerns that required constant vigilance. The Royal Protection Service maintained files on dozens of individuals considered persons of interest, from political extremists to mentally unstable individuals who had developed unhealthy obsessions with the royal family. A black sedan approached Gate 7, moving at a measured pace. Marcus straightened his posture and prepared to conduct the standard security check. The vehicle bore diplomatic plates, which meant it was likely carrying a foreign dignitary for a scheduled meeting. These visits were common, part of the endless stream of international relations that kept the palace busy throughout the year. The sedan stopped at the checkpoint, and Marcus approached the driver's side window. The man behind the wheel appeared to be in his 40s, wearing a dark suit and tie. His passenger, visible through the rear window, was similarly dressed. Both men presented their credentials without speaking, which was typical for diplomatic security protocols. As Marcus examined the documents, something nagged at him. The paperwork appeared legitimate, but there was something about the passenger's behavior that seemed off. The man kept glancing toward the main palace building, his eyes scanning the upper windows with an intensity that seemed to go beyond casual curiosity. His hands fidgeted with something in his lap, though Marcus couldn't see what it was from his position. The credentials checked out according to the master list provided during the morning briefing. Ambassador Rodriguez from the South American delegation was scheduled for a 10 o'clock meeting with the Deputy Foreign Secretary. The timing was correct, the documentation was in order, and yet Marcus felt an inexplicable unease settling in his stomach. During training, Sergeant Williams had spoken about trusting instincts. "Your brain processes thousands of tiny details that your conscious mind doesn't even register," he had explained. "When something feels wrong, don't ignore that feeling. It might be the difference between a normal day and a national tragedy." Marcus handed the documents back to the driver and stepped away from the vehicle, speaking into his radio. "Control, this is Sentinel 7. Diplomatic vehicle at Eastern Gate, credentials verified for Ambassador Rodriguez. Requesting secondary confirmation on appointment details." The response came back quickly. "Sentinel 7, appointment confirmed. You are cleared to allow entry." The driver gave a polite nod and began to pull forward, but Marcus held up his hand. "One moment, please," he called out. The sedan stopped again, and Marcus could see both occupants exchange a quick glance. It was subtle, but it confirmed his growing suspicion that something wasn't right about this situation. Walking around to the passenger side, Marcus tapped gently on the rear window. The man inside looked up with what appeared to be surprise, though his eyes held a hardness that didn't match the diplomatic setting. When the window rolled down, Marcus leaned slightly forward to speak. "Good morning, Ambassador. I hope you don't mind the additional security check. We've had some updated protocols recently." Marcus watched the man's face carefully, looking for any tells that might confirm his suspicions. The passenger smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, officer. Security is paramount." His accent was slight but noticeable, and Marcus realized it didn't match the South American delegation he was supposed to represent. The pronunciation was wrong, the inflection off in a way that suggested the man was working hard to disguise his natural speech patterns. "Could you please step out of the vehicle for a moment?" Marcus asked, his hand moving subtly toward his radio. "Just routine procedure for diplomatic visitors." The tension in the sedan was palpable now. Both men sat perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat in his ears as he waited for their response, every instinct telling him that his quiet morning was about to become something much more dangerous. The passenger's hand moved toward his jacket, and Marcus saw the beginning of what looked like a sudden, coordinated movement from both men. Time seemed to slow as he realized that his grandmother's words about standing between order and chaos were about to be tested in the most direct way possible. The morning mist hung heavy over the palace grounds as Marcus Chen adjusted his crisp uniform for the third time. His hands trembled slightly, not from the cold October air, but from the weight of responsibility that came with his first week as a royal sentinel. The golden badge on his chest caught the early sunlight streaming through the ancient oak trees that lined the ceremonial pathway. At 24, Marcus had dreamed of this moment since childhood. Growing up in a small mining town, he had watched the royal ceremonies on television with his grandmother, mesmerized by the precision and dignity of the guards who protected the monarchy. His grandmother would point to the screen with her weathered finger and say, "Those men carry the honor of our nation, Marcus. They stand between order and chaos." Now he was one of them, positioned at Gate 7 of the palace complex, the eastern entrance reserved for diplomatic vehicles and special guests. The assignment was considered routine for a new recruit, but Marcus took it seriously. His training instructor, Sergeant Williams, had drummed into every cadet that there was no such thing as a routine day in royal protection. The radio on his shoulder crackled, softly with periodic check-ins from other sentinels positioned throughout the sprawling estate. "Sector 4, all clear. Main gate, no issues to report." The familiar rhythm of these communications had become oddly comforting to Marcus over his short tenure. As he walked the perimeter of his assigned area, Marcus noticed the usual morning activity beginning to stir. Kitchen staff wheeled carts of fresh produce toward the service entrances. Groundskeepers emerged from maintenance buildings with their equipment, preparing to tend to the immaculate gardens that surrounded the palace. A small group of tourists had already gathered beyond the outer fence, cameras ready to capture any glimpse of royal activity. The October air carried the scent of fallen leaves and the distant aroma of fresh bread from the palace kitchens. Marcus found himself thinking about his girlfriend Sarah, who worked as a nurse in the city hospital. She had been worried about his new position, expressing concerns about the dangers that came with protecting such high-profile targets. "The world is different now," she had said the night before his first shift. "There are people out there who want to make statements, and they don't care who gets hurt." Her words echoed in his mind as he continued his patrol. The intelligence briefings during training had been sobering. Threats against the monarchy had increased in recent years, ranging from disorganized protesters to more serious security concerns that required constant vigilance. The Royal Protection Service maintained files on dozens of individuals considered persons of interest, from political extremists to mentally unstable individuals who had developed unhealthy obsessions with the royal family. A black sedan approached Gate 7, moving at a measured pace. Marcus straightened his posture and prepared to conduct the standard security check. The vehicle bore diplomatic plates, which meant it was likely carrying a foreign dignitary for a scheduled meeting. These visits were common, part of the endless stream of international relations that kept the palace busy throughout the year. The sedan stopped at the checkpoint, and Marcus approached the driver's side window. The man behind the wheel appeared to be in his 40s, wearing a dark suit and tie. His passenger, visible through the rear window, was similarly dressed. Both men presented their credentials without speaking, which was typical for diplomatic security protocols. As Marcus examined the documents, something nagged at him. The paperwork appeared legitimate, but there was something about the passenger's behavior that seemed off. The man kept glancing toward the main palace building, his eyes scanning the upper windows with an intensity that seemed to go beyond casual curiosity. His hands fidgeted with something in his lap, though Marcus couldn't see what it was from his position. The credentials checked out according to the master list provided during the morning briefing. Ambassador Rodriguez from the South American delegation was scheduled for a 10 o'clock meeting with the Deputy Foreign Secretary. The timing was correct, the documentation was in order, and yet Marcus felt an inexplicable unease settling in his stomach. During training, Sergeant Williams had spoken about trusting instincts. Your brain processes thousands of tiny details that your conscious mind doesn't even register, he had explained. When something feels wrong, don't ignore that feeling. It might be the difference between a normal day and a national tragedy. Marcus handed the documents back to the driver and stepped away from the vehicle, speaking into his radio. Control, this is Sentinel 7. Diplomatic vehicle at Eastern Gate, credentials verified for Ambassador Rodriguez. Requesting secondary confirmation on appointment details. The response came back quickly. Sentinel 7, appointment confirmed. You are cleared to allow entry. The driver gave a polite nod and began to pull forward, but Marcus held up his hand. One moment, please, he called out. The sedan stopped again, and Marcus could see both occupants exchange a quick glance. It was subtle, but it confirmed his growing suspicion that something wasn't right about this situation. Walking around to the passenger side, Marcus tapped gently on the rear window. The man inside looked up with what appeared to be surprise, though his eyes held a hardness that didn't match the diplomatic setting. When the window rolled down, Marcus leaned slightly forward to speak. Good morning, Ambassador. I hope you don't mind the additional security check. We've had some updated protocols recently. Marcus watched the man's face carefully, looking for any tells that might confirm his suspicions. The passenger smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Of course, officer. Security is paramount. His accent was slight but noticeable, and Marcus realized it didn't match the South American delegation he was supposed to represent. The pronunciation was wrong, the inflection off in a way that suggested the man was working hard to disguise his natural speech patterns. Could you please step out of the vehicle for a moment? Marcus asked, his hand moving subtly toward his radio. Just routine procedure for diplomatic visitors. The tension in the sedan was palpable now. Both men sat perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat in his ears as he waited for their response, every instinct telling him that his quiet morning was about to become something much more dangerous. The passenger's hand moved toward his jacket, and Marcus saw the beginning of what looked like a sudden, coordinated movement from both men. Time seemed to slow as he realized that his grandmother's words about standing between order and chaos were about to be tested in the most direct way possible. The tactical situation evolved rapidly as specialized units arrived on scene. Marcus watched from his position as counter-terrorism specialists in black tactical gear, deployed with equipment he had only seen in training videos. Their movements were even more precise than the regular security teams, each operator knowing exactly where to position themselves for maximum effectiveness. A new voice crackled through Marcus's radio, speaking with the clipped authority of someone accustomed to high-stakes situations. All units, this is Gold Command. We have visual confirmation of explosive devices on both suspects. Snipers are authorized to engage with extreme prejudice. Priority is preventing detonation within blast radius of main structure. The weight of those words settled over Marcus like a heavy blanket. The palace wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of national stability and continuity. Damage to the structure would be devastating not just physically, but psychologically for the entire country. The attackers understood this, which made their tactical knowledge even more concerning. From his vantage point, Marcus could see the lead attacker had reached the ornate steps leading to the main entrance. The man moved with surprising speed despite his wounds. driven by whatever fanatical purpose had brought him to this moment. His explosive vest was clearly visible now, a crude but effective arrangement of plastique and metal fragments that would cause massive destruction if detonated near the historic building. The sniper's rifle cracked like thunder, the sound echoing off the surrounding walls with sharp precision. The lead attacker stumbled but didn't fall, protected by what appeared to be body armor beneath his vest. He turned toward the direction of the shot, raising his weapon to return fire at targets he couldn't possibly see clearly. Marcus realized he was witnessing a deadly game of chess played at lightning speed. The attackers had planned for resistance, but the security forces had trained for exactly this scenario. Every move and countermove had been anticipated by both sides, creating a lethal ballet of tactics and countertactics. The wounded attacker by the fountain suddenly stood and began running toward the main building, apparently abandoning any pretense of cover. His explosive vest was visible beneath his torn jacket, and Marcus could see the man's finger positioned over what appeared to be a detonator switch. Control. Suspect 2 is making a suicide run toward main entrance, Marcus shouted into his radio. He's got his hand on the detonator. Multiple snipers fired simultaneously, the coordinated shots creating a thunderous volley that seemed to shake the entire courtyard. The running attacker jerked and stumbled but maintained his forward momentum through sheer determination. Blood streamed from multiple wounds, but he continued his desperate charge toward the palace steps. The tactical teams had anticipated this scenario. As the wounded attacker approached the building, Marcus saw something that would stay with him forever. A small remote-controlled robot, no bigger than a briefcase, rolled out from behind cover and positioned itself directly in the attacker's path. The explosion was tremendous, a flash of light and sound that temporarily overwhelmed Marcus's senses. When his vision cleared, he saw that the controlled detonation had stopped the attacker short of his target, but the blast had shattered windows throughout the east wing of the palace. The historical significance of the damage would be calculated later. For now, the important thing was that the main structure remained intact. The remaining attacker, now alone and surrounded, seemed to realize his mission was failing. Instead of surrendering, he began moving toward a group of maintenance workers who had been caught in the open when the lockdown began. Marcus felt his stomach drop as he understood the man's new strategy. He's going for hostages, Marcus radioed urgently. 3 maintenance staff trapped near the service building. The tactical team shifted their positions rapidly, but they were caught in an impossible situation. Engaging the attacker might trigger his explosive device, but allowing him to reach the civilians would create an even worse scenario. The maintenance workers, 2 men and a woman, huddled behind a small utility shed that provided minimal protection. Marcus found himself thinking about the training scenarios he had practiced during his preparation for this job. The instructors had always emphasized that real situations never unfolded exactly like the exercises, but they had stressed the importance of making quick decisions when lives hung in the balance. Without fully realizing what he was doing, Marcus left his position behind the checkpoint barrier. His training told him to stay put and continue observing, but something deeper compelled him to act. The maintenance workers were fellow employees, people he had chatted with during his first week on the job. He couldn't watch them become pawns in someone else's political statement. Moving in a low crouch, Marcus used the abandoned sedan as cover while he circled toward the service building. His heart pounded as he realized he was essentially going rogue, acting outside the established tactical plan. But sometimes, he reasoned, the plan needed to adapt to circumstances that couldn't be anticipated. The attacker was about 30 yards from the trapped maintenance workers when Marcus emerged from behind the sedan. "Stop right there," he shouted, raising his sidearm in the standard 2-handed grip he had practiced countless hours at the training range. The man turned toward Marcus, with wild eyes that held the fervor of someone completely committed to his cause. Blood from multiple wounds had stained his shirt dark red, but his grip on the detonator remained steady. When he spoke, his accent was unmistakably foreign, confirming Marcus's earlier suspicions about the fake diplomatic credentials. "You cannot stop what has already begun," the attacker said, his voice carrying across the courtyard despite the continuing wail of sirens. "This is merely the first movement of a much larger symphony." The words chilled Marcus more than the October air. This wasn't an isolated incident, but part of something bigger. Intelligence agencies would spend months unraveling the full scope of whatever organization had planned this attack. For now, though, Marcus focused on the immediate threat to the 3 civilians crouched behind inadequate cover. "Release the detonator and step away from those people," Marcus called out, trying to project more confidence than he felt. "You're surrounded. This doesn't have to end with more deaths." The attacker smiled, an expression that looked grotesque on his blood-streaked face. "Death is merely a transition, young Sentinel. Today marks the beginning of a new chapter in history." Marcus could hear tactical teams repositioning around them, but he knew they were waiting for him to create an opportunity. The sniper rifles were probably trained on the attacker, but the proximity to civilians and the explosive vest limited their options. Everything now depended on the next few seconds and the decisions made by 2 men facing each other across 30 yards of Palace Courtyard. The morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the scene. News helicopters circled overhead like mechanical vultures, their cameras broadcasting the standoff to viewers around the world. Marcus realized that millions of people were watching him face the most important decision of his life, though he couldn't allow himself to think about that pressure. Instead, he thought about his grandmother's words about standing between order and chaos, and about Sarah's concerns for his safety. Most of all, he thought about the 3 maintenance workers whose lives depended on what happened in the next crucial moments. The standoff stretched across what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Marcus could see the maintenance workers huddled behind their inadequate shelter, their faces etched with terror as they found themselves at the center of an international incident. The woman whom Marcus recognized as Elena from the housekeeping staff was quietly weeping while the 2 men tried to shield her with their bodies. Through his earpiece, Marcus could hear the tactical commanders coordinating their response. Multiple agencies were now involved, their voices overlapping as they tried to manage a situation that had spiraled far beyond the scope of normal palace security. The presence of explosives had elevated this from an armed assault to a potential terrorist bombing with international implications. "Sentinel 7, this is Gold Command," came the voice through his radio. "We have you in sight. Do not engage without authorization. Repeat, do not engage." Marcus understood the command, but he also understood that sometimes field conditions required decisions that couldn't wait for authorization from distant commanders. The attacker's behavior suggested he was operating on a timeline that might not give negotiators the luxury of extended talks. The wounded man began moving again, not toward the maintenance workers but in a circular pattern that would keep Marcus between himself and the hidden snipers. It was a tactically sound move that demonstrated this was no amateur terrorist. Someone had trained him well in urban combat techniques and hostage situations. "You're making this more complicated than necessary," Marcus called out, trying to keep the man talking while tactical teams repositioned. "What do you want? What's your message?" The attacker's laugh was harsh and bitter. "My message is being broadcast live to the world right now, young Sentinel. Every second this continues, more people understand that your symbols of power are not as secure as you pretend." As he spoke, Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. The man was bleeding heavily from multiple gunshot wounds, but he showed no signs of weakening. His movements remained controlled and purposeful, suggesting he had been given some form of combat stimulant that was keeping him functional, despite injuries that should have incapacitated him. Professional terrorists with access to military-grade drugs. The implications were staggering. This level of sophistication suggested state-level support or involvement from a major criminal organization. Marcus realized he might be facing the advance element of a much larger operation designed to destabilize the government. "The people you're trying to protect don't even know your name," the attacker continued, his voice carrying an odd mix of contempt and pity. "You're just another replaceable part in a machine that grinds up young men like you for the benefit of those who will never face any real danger themselves." The words hit closer to home than Marcus wanted to admit. He thought about his modest salary, his tiny apartment, and the fact that he would probably never be able to afford a house in the same city where he risked his life protecting others. But he also thought about the oath he had taken and the meaning behind the uniform he wore. "Maybe," Marcus replied, surprising himself with his calm tone. "But those 3 people behind you have names. Elena has 2 children at home. The men with her have families who are probably watching this on television right now, terrified that they might lose someone they love." For the first time, the attacker seemed to hesitate. He glanced back toward the maintenance workers, and Marcus saw something flicker across his face that might have been uncertainty or even regret. It was a tiny opening, but Marcus had been trained to recognize and exploit such moments. "You can still walk away from this," Marcus continued, taking a small step forward while keeping his weapon trained on the man. "Whatever message you wanted to send has already been delivered. The whole world is watching. You've made your point." The attacker shook his head slowly, but the movement seemed less decisive than before. "It's too late for that. Some doors once opened cannot be closed again." Through his peripheral vision, Marcus could see tactical teams moving into better positions. A negotiator had arrived and was setting up equipment to establish direct communication with the attacker. The situation was evolving from an immediate crisis toward what might become an extended siege situation, but something in the attacker's demeanor suggested he wasn't planning to allow this to drag on. His hand tightened on the detonator, and Marcus realized the man was preparing to make his final move. Whatever timeline he was operating under was approaching its conclusion. "Elena," Marcus called out to the maintenance worker without taking his eyes off the attacker. "Can you and your colleagues move back toward the service entrance? Very slowly, stay low." The woman looked up with tear-streaked cheeks, clearly too terrified to move. One of the men with her, an older gentleman Marcus had seen tending the gardens, began to carefully guide Elena and their companion toward the building behind them. Every inch they moved away from the attacker increased their chances of survival if the explosive vest detonated. The attacker watched this movement but made no attempt to stop it. Perhaps some part of his humanity remained intact, despite whatever indoctrination had brought him to this point. Or perhaps he simply recognized that his window of opportunity was closing and he needed to act quickly. "You cannot save everyone. Sentinel," the man said, his voice growing weaker as blood loss began to affect him despite whatever drugs were keeping him upright. "The forces we represent are larger than any individual. This palace, this system, this entire way of life is ending whether you stop me or not." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. The man wasn't speaking like a lone fanatic, but as a representative of something organized and ongoing. Intelligence services would need to examine every word of this conversation to understand the scope of whatever threat was emerging. The maintenance workers had reached the service entrance and disappeared inside the building, reducing Marcus's immediate concerns to just himself and the wounded terrorist. The tactical equation had simplified, but it had also become more deadly. With no hostages to worry about, the snipers would have clearer shots, but they were still constrained by the explosive vest. "Last chance," Marcus said, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to the attacker or to himself. "Drop the detonator and surrender. You're wounded and surrounded. This is over." The man looked directly at Marcus for the first time since their confrontation began. His eyes held a mixture of pain, determination, and what might have been respect for a fellow professional doing his job under impossible circumstances. "You're a good soldier, Sentinel. In another world we might have been on the same side." Then he smiled, and Marcus knew with absolute certainty that the talking was over. The attacker's thumb moved toward the detonator switch, and time seemed to compress into a single crystalline moment. Marcus fired 3 shots in rapid succession, the training taking over as conscious thought became impossible. The bullet struck center mass, but the man's forward momentum carried him several more steps before he collapsed. The explosive vest remained intact. Whatever dead man switch mechanism the attackers had been counting on failed to function, possibly damaged by the gunshots or disabled by the man's rapid blood loss. Marcus continued to hold his position, weapon trained on the motionless figure as tactical teams swarmed the area. The silence that followed seemed deafening after the chaos of the past hour. Even the sirens had stopped wailing, replaced by the methodical communications of bomb disposal specialists who were approaching the fallen attacker with careful precision. Marcus found himself shaking as adrenaline began to fade, replaced by the full weight of what had just occurred. "Sentinel 7, this is Gold Command. Outstanding work. Maintain your position while EOD secures the device." The bomb disposal team worked with practiced efficiency, their protective suits making them look like astronauts as they examined the explosive vest. Marcus watched them cut specific wires and carefully remove components, each action potentially preventing a blast that could have devastated the historic building and killed dozens of people. As the immediate danger passed, Marcus became aware of the broader scope of the response that had mobilized around them. Military helicopters circled the palace complex while armored vehicles had established checkpoints on every access road. The attack had triggered security protocols that extended far beyond the palace grounds, affecting government buildings throughout the capital. His radio crackled with a new voice, one carrying the authority of very senior leadership. Sentinel 7, this is Director Harrison. I want you to know that your actions today likely prevented a national catastrophe. Well done. The praise felt surreal given the circumstances. Marcus looked around at the scene of destruction. Bullet holes in historic stonework, shattered windows, bloodstains on manicured lawns, and the acrid smell of gunpowder mixing with the October air. It didn't feel like a victory, even though he understood intellectually that it was. Emergency medical teams were now examining the bodies of both attackers, looking for clues about their identities and the organization behind them. Their equipment was being cataloged by forensic specialists who would spend weeks analyzing every component for intelligence value. The fake diplomatic credentials would be traced through multiple agencies to understand how they had been created and validated. Marcus noticed a familiar figure approaching through the organized chaos. Sergeant Williams, his training instructor, walked with the measured pace of someone who had seen enough crises to know that the immediate danger was over, but the long-term implications were just beginning. "How are you holding up, Chen?" the sergeant asked, his voice carrying the same steady tone he had used during training exercises. "I keep thinking about what he said," Marcus replied, holstering his weapon as the scene continued to be secured around them. "About this being just the beginning. About forces larger than any individual." Williams nodded grimly. "Intelligence is going to be very interested in every word that was spoken out here. This level of coordination and preparation suggests we're dealing with something more sophisticated than the usual terrorist groups." As if summoned by their conversation, several individuals in dark suits approached Marcus. Their badges identified them as representatives from multiple intelligence agencies, each wanting to debrief him while his memories were still fresh. The questions would be detailed and repetitive, designed to extract every possible piece of information about the attacker's behavior, equipment, and statements. "Before we get into all that," Sergeant Williams said, "you should know that your girlfriend has been trying to reach you. The hospital where she works has been put on alert to receive casualties from this incident. She's been worried sick." The mention of Sarah brought Marcus back to the personal reality of what had happened. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, his family and friends had been watching news coverage of the attack, probably seeing his face on television as he confronted the terrorist. The thought of Sarah's anxiety added another layer of emotional complexity to an already overwhelming day. "There's something else you need to know," Williams continued, lowering his voice slightly. "Initial intelligence suggests this attack was coordinated with attempted incidents at 2 other government facilities. Both were intercepted before they could develop into active situations, but it confirms that we're dealing with an organized conspiracy." The information hit Marcus like a physical blow. If there had been simultaneous attacks planned across multiple targets, then the scope of the threat was even larger than the dying terrorist had suggested. Security services would now be conducting a massive investigation to identify all the participants and determine whether additional attacks were still planned. A forensic photographer was documenting the scene, capturing images that would be studied by analysts and historians for years to come. The palace attack would become a case study in terrorist tactics and security response, analyzed in training academies and discussed in academic papers. Marcus realized that his split-second decisions would be examined and debated by experts who had never faced life-or-death situations themselves. The bomb disposal team gave an all-clear signal, indicating that both explosive devices had been safely neutralized. The immediate physical danger was over, but Marcus understood that the psychological and political impact was just beginning. Questions would be asked about how the attackers had obtained their intelligence about Palace, security procedures, and whether there had been any breach of internal protocols. Sentinel. "Chen," called one of the intelligence officers, "we need to begin your debriefing as soon as possible. Events are moving quickly and your observations may be crucial for preventing additional attacks." Marcus nodded, though part of him wanted nothing more than to go home, hold Sarah, and pretend this day had never happened. Instead, he followed the officers toward a mobile command center that had been established in the palace courtyard, understanding that his real work was just beginning. As they walked, He caught sight of the maintenance workers he had helped save. Elena was being examined by paramedics, but she was alive and appeared to be physically unharmed. The two men with her were giving statements to investigators, their faces still showing the shock of their narrow escape. That small victory felt more meaningful to Marcus than any official commendation he might receive. Real people had gone home to their families because of the actions taken by everyone involved in the response. In a world that often seemed dominated by abstract threats and political maneuvering, that concrete human outcome provided a foundation of purpose that would sustain him through whatever investigations and consequences followed. The intelligence debriefing would be thorough and probably exhausting, but Marcus faced it with the knowledge that he had done his job when it mattered most. The terrorists' prediction about this being just the beginning might prove accurate, but the response had shown that the system designed to protect society could still function when tested by determined enemies. As he entered the mobile command center, Marcus caught one last glimpse of the palace building, its ancient stones marked by bullets but still standing strong against the October sky. The debriefing session stretched into the late afternoon, conducted in a secure facility several miles from the palace complex. Marcus found himself seated across from a panel of investigators representing various intelligence agencies, each bringing their own expertise and perspective to understanding what had occurred. The questions came in waves, each investigator focusing on different aspects of the attack. A counter-terrorism specialist wanted detailed descriptions of the attackers' equipment and tactics. A behavioral analyst asked about their demeanor and statements. A forensic expert inquired about the precise sequence of events leading to the final confrontation. Marcus discovered that his memory of the crisis was both remarkably clear and frustratingly incomplete. He could recall exact words spoken by the terrorist, the specific sound of different weapons being fired, and minute details about the men's movements and equipment. Yet other aspects remained hazy, compressed by the intensity of the moment into impressions rather than concrete facts. "Let's focus on the suspect's final statements," said Dr. Patricia Morse, a senior analyst from the National Intelligence Service. He mentioned forces larger than any individual and suggested this was part of a broader campaign. "Did he give any indication of timing for future attacks or specific targets?" Marcus closed his eyes, trying to recall the exact words. He said this was merely the first movement of a larger symphony. When I told him it was over, he said some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. It felt like he was speaking for an organization, not just expressing personal beliefs. The investigators exchanged glances that Marcus had learned to recognize over the course of the long session. Each piece of information he provided was being cross-referenced with intelligence from other sources, building a picture of the threat that extended far beyond the morning's events. "We've identified both attackers," announced Agent Richardson from the Domestic Security Service. Neither was actually from South America, despite their documentation. Preliminary analysis suggests they entered the country separately over the past 6 months using different identities. The revelation confirmed Marcus's instincts about the fake diplomatic credentials, but it also raised disturbing questions about how thoroughly the attack had been planned. 6 months of preparation suggested access to significant resources and sophisticated support networks. "There's something else," Dr. Morse continued. "The explosive devices were more sophisticated than typical terrorist weapons. The components suggest military-grade materials and professional assembly. We're looking at the possibility of state sponsorship or involvement from organized crime networks with access to advanced weaponry." Marcus felt a chill as the implications became clear. If foreign governments were involved in attacking the palace, the incident could escalate beyond terrorism into matters of international relations and potential military response. The stakes were much higher than a simple security breach. His phone had been returned to him during a break in the questioning, and he found several worried messages from Sarah. The hospital where she worked had been treating injured security personnel from related incidents throughout the day. Her text revealed that the attack on the palace had been part of a coordinated assault on multiple government facilities, just as Sergeant Williams had indicated. "Can you tell me about the other attacks?" Marcus asked during a brief pause in the questioning. Agent Richardson consulted his notes. Simultaneous attempts were made on the Parliament building and the Defense Ministry. Both were intercepted in the planning stages thanks to intelligence gathered over the past several weeks. Your incident was the only one that reached the active assault phase. The information was both reassuring and troubling. The security services had successfully prevented most of the planned attacks, demonstrating that the intelligence apparatus was functioning effectively. However, the fact that the palace assault had proceeded undetected suggested gaps in the monitoring systems that would need to be addressed. We believe the palace was chosen as the primary target specifically because of its symbolic value, Dr. Morse explained. An attack there would generate maximum international attention and psychological impact, regardless of the actual physical damage achieved. Marcus thought about the news helicopters that had circled overhead during the crisis, broadcasting live footage to audiences around the world. The terrorists had understood modern media dynamics and had planned their assault to maximize its propaganda value. Every moment of the confrontation had been viewed by millions of people, creating exactly the kind of global attention the attackers had wanted. As the debriefing continued, Marcus learned that investigators had already begun tracing the attackers' movements over the previous months. Security cameras throughout the city were being analyzed to understand how they had conducted reconnaissance of the palace. Financial records were being examined to identify funding sources and potential accomplices. "Your quick thinking probably saved dozens of lives," Agent Richardson told him as the formal questioning drew to a close. "If those explosives had detonated near the main building, we would have faced casualties among staff, possible structural damage to irreplaceable historical architecture, and a propaganda victory for whoever organized this attack." The praise felt heavy rather than gratifying. Marcus understood that he had performed well under extraordinary circumstances, but he also understood that the broader threat remained active. Other cells might be planning additional attacks, and the investigation was just beginning to unravel the full scope of the conspiracy. A victim services counselor approached as the intelligence officers concluded their immediate questioning. "Mr. Chen, it's important that you understand you may experience delayed reactions to today's events. Post-traumatic stress is common after incidents like this, and there are resources available to help you process what happened." Marcus nodded, though he felt oddly detached from the idea that he might need psychological support. The immediate crisis had demanded complete focus on tactical realities, leaving little room for emotional processing. Now that the danger had passed, he was beginning to feel the weight of having taken a human life, even in defense of others. "There will be additional debriefing sessions over the coming days," Dr. Morse informed him as the meeting concluded. "We're still analyzing evidence from the scene and correlating information from multiple sources. Your observations may become even more valuable as we develop a fuller understanding of the organization behind these attacks." As Marcus prepared to leave the secure facility, he was given a preliminary timeline for the ongoing investigation. The forensic analysis of the explosive devices would take several weeks. Tracing the attackers' identities and movements could require months of international cooperation. Understanding the full scope of the terrorist network might take years. The drive back to his apartment took him through parts of the city where life appeared to be continuing normally. People walked along sidewalks, entered shops, and went about their daily routines, seemingly unaware that their world had been changed by the morning's events. Only the increased police presence and occasional roadblocks suggested that anything unusual had occurred. Sarah was waiting for him when he arrived home, her face showing the strain of a day spent worrying about someone she loved who was facing mortal danger. She had left work early after learning about the palace attack, spending hours watching news coverage that showed her boyfriend in a standoff with an armed terrorist. "I saw you on television," she said simply, wrapping her arms around him with fierce intensity. "I saw you standing there with that man pointing a gun at you, and I thought I might lose you." For the first time since the crisis began, Marcus felt his emotional defenses beginning to crack. The weight of the day's events, the knowledge that he had killed another human being, and the understanding that he had come very close to dying himself, all combined into a wave of delayed reaction that left him trembling in Sarah's embrace. 3 months after the palace attack, Marcus stood in the same courtyard where he had faced the terrorist, but everything had changed. The bullet holes in the stonework had been carefully repaired by master craftsmen who specialized in historical restoration. New security measures were visible everywhere, from additional cameras to reinforced barriers that maintained the palace's aesthetic while providing enhanced protection. The investigation had revealed the scope of what intelligence agencies were now calling Operation Broken Crown, a coordinated attempt by a coalition of international terrorist groups to destabilize the government through simultaneous attacks on symbolic targets. The two men Marcus had confronted were part of a larger network that included sleeper cells in 3 different countries, funded through a complex web of shell companies and criminal enterprises. Marcus had been promoted to senior Sentinel and assigned to a special protective detail that rotated between various government facilities. The recognition felt appropriate, but it came with the knowledge that his face was now known to potential enemies around the world. Security experts had explained that his prominent role in stopping the palace attack made him a target for retaliation by affiliated terrorist groups. The psychological counseling had proven more necessary than he initially expected. The nightmares had started 2 weeks after the incident. Vivid dreams where he relived the confrontation but with different, catastrophic outcomes. Sometimes the explosives detonated, destroying the palace and killing everyone inside. Sometimes he hesitated to shoot, allowing the terrorist to reach his target successfully. Dr. Jennifer Hawkins, his assigned counselor, had explained that such delayed reactions were normal for people who had experienced life-threatening situations. Your mind was completely focused on survival during the crisis, she told him during one of their sessions. Only afterward does it have the luxury of processing the full emotional impact of what occurred. The sessions had helped him understand that taking a life, even in defense of others, carried psychological consequences that would stay with him permanently. He had learned techniques for managing the intrusive thoughts and developing healthy ways to process the complex emotions that arose from his actions that day. Sarah had been incredibly supportive throughout his recovery, but Marcus could see that the incident had changed their relationship as well. She looked at him differently now, with a mixture of pride and concern that reflected her understanding of the dangers inherent in his chosen profession. They had talked about marriage before the attack. Now those conversations included discussions about the risks they would both face as the family of a high-profile security officer. The broader investigation had led to arrests in 4 countries and the disruption of several planned attacks on government facilities. International cooperation had been unprecedented, with intelligence agencies sharing information that had previously been closely guarded. The threat that had seemed so overwhelming during the palace crisis was being systematically dismantled through careful police work and diplomatic pressure. Marcus often thought about the maintenance workers he had helped save that day. Elena had returned to work at the palace, though she had been transferred to duties that kept her away from the security perimeter. The two men had both received commendations for their calm behavior during the crisis. All 3 had participated in a ceremony honoring the various personnel who had responded to the attack. The media attention had been intense for several weeks following the incident. Marcus had given carefully controlled interviews designed to demonstrate that the security services were capable of protecting government facilities while avoiding details that might compromise operational security. He had been uncomfortable with the publicity, but intelligence officials explained that showing a human face of effective security response was important for maintaining public confidence. His grandmother had watched every news report about the attack, calling him repeatedly to express her pride in his actions. "You stood between order and chaos just like I always said," she told him during one of their conversations. "But I never imagined it would be so literal." The palace had reopened to tourists 2 months after the attack, with new security procedures that balanced public access with enhanced protection. Marcus occasionally worked shifts where he could see the visitors taking photographs of the building he had helped protect, most of them unaware of exactly what had transpired in the courtyard they were walking through. Sergeant Williams had been promoted to training commander, tasked with incorporating lessons learned from the palace attack into the curriculum for new recruits. He had asked Marcus to participate in some of the training sessions, sharing his first-hand experience with candidates who would soon be taking their own positions as Royal Sentinels. "The most important thing," Marcus told one group of trainees, "is trusting your instincts when something feels wrong. All the tactical training in the world won't help if you ignore the warning signs that your subconscious mind is processing." The new recruits listened with the intense attention of people who understood they might someday face similar situations. Marcus could see himself in their faces, remembering his own nervousness during the early days of his assignment. He wondered which of them would be tested by real crisis and how they would respond when their training was put to the ultimate test. The intelligence reports he was now cleared to read painted a sobering picture of ongoing threats. Operation Broken Crown had been disrupted, but other groups were adapting their tactics based on lessons learned from the failed attack. Security services around the world were sharing information about new methods of surveillance, infiltration, and assault that required constant vigilance. On quiet days, Marcus found himself standing in the same spot where he had first noticed something wrong with the diplomatic sedan. The memory remained vivid, but it no longer triggered the immediate stress response that had characterized his early recovery. Time and counseling had helped him process the experience into something he could carry without being overwhelmed by its emotional weight. Sarah had joined him for one of these reflective visits, wanting to understand the place where their lives had been so dramatically changed. As they stood together in the peaceful courtyard, she asked him if he ever regretted choosing a career that involved such risks. Sometimes, Marcus admitted, but then I think about Elena and her children, about all the people who work here, about what this place represents. Someone has to stand guard. Someone has to be ready when ordinary people need protection from extraordinary threats. The afternoon sun cast the same kind of shadows that had marked the morning of the attack, but now they seemed peaceful rather than ominous. Marcus understood that he would always carry the memory of that day, but he had learned to integrate it into a broader understanding of his role in maintaining the stability that most people took for granted. His radio crackled with routine communications from other Sentinels, positioned throughout the complex. The familiar rhythm of security checks and status reports had become comforting again, a reminder that the system designed to protect society was functioning as intended. The palace stood secure, the government continued its work, and life moved forward despite the efforts of those who sought to disrupt it through violence and fear. As his shift ended and he walked toward the exit, Marcus reflected on how much had changed since that October morning, when two men had lunged at the gates of the Royal Sentinel post, setting off alarms and sirens that echoed through more than just the palace grounds. The attack had been intended to demonstrate vulnerability and create fear. Instead, it had revealed strength and inspired confidence in the institutions that sustained democratic society. The threat would never completely disappear, but neither would the commitment of people willing to stand guard against it. Marcus understood now that this was not just his job but his calling, and he faced the future with quiet determination, born from the knowledge that when tested, he had not failed those who depended on his protection.